for inviting me to give this presentation. I should say that I read the position statement that Socialist Democracy put out around about the Ukraine war, its implications, and the kind of stance that the left should take, and I'm wholly in agreement with it. So people, we can maybe cut things short, and people could go and read that. But probably better than that is that if I give you some of my thoughts, knowing that this is a knowledgeable audience. And then we can give as much time as possible for discussion. So if you'll forgive me, because I know people know and will have followed quite a lot of this, I'm not going to go through things in great detail. I'm going to try to make some points. One, about the war, where we are. Second, about the general socialist attitude to war and where that impacts on where we are, and lastly about what it is that we can try to do in each of our respective circumstances. I am English, I am from Britain, but I now live in Athens in Greece, and I'm going to refer a little bit to the Greek political reality towards the end. But the first thing is, this is a major war. It's not the first major war, and unlike what we've been told, I don't know about what it's like in Ireland, south and north. I know what it's like in Britain and in not so in Greece, but Britain and in some other countries. Which is this is the first. Well, this is terrible because it's the first war of its kind in Europe since the Second World War, which is complete rubbish. I live in the Balkans. We had a succession of wars arising from the implosion, explosion, pulling apart, however you want to describe it, of Yugoslavia, in which tens of thousands of people were killed. Major wars throughout the 1990s, culminating in the NATO bombing of what was left of Yugoslavia in 1999. And I think one of the things that certainly I feel is in the media and governmental reception of this war is a blindsidedness, if not a complete chauvinism, when it comes to other wars that have been committed. I mean, just the example of the refugees. Again, I don't know about the question in Ireland. I know that in Britain and in Greece, that you have governments very hypocritically claiming to be in favour of the rights of the Ukrainian refugees, and indeed a considerable effort got into, European-wide effort got into receiving the Ukrainian refugees. I live in a country where Afghan, Syrian refugees, Pakistani newcomers and so on are held in internment camps on islands. So we get, I think from the beginning, a sense that this is a major war. There is terrible suffering, and there's also huge hypocrisy from our governments. In saying it's a major war, I mean, I'm not going to give a homily, but I do think it's worth starting off with where most people, I think, most of the time are at, which is that they are with Isaiah 2:4, that we want an end to war. We want to beat the swords into plowshares so that no longer will nation rise up with sword against another nation. And that's very important, because what I think is happening in this huge suffering is that the fundamental sentiment of working class people, be they in Russia, be they in Ukraine, Europe, wherever, which is for peace and is for justice and is for an end to this suffering, is being usurped in all sorts of ways, in the way that Jonathan described, and which I'll come back to. And one of the aspects of that is that we face enormous confusion in trying to understand what's going on day by day. I'll give you one example. We were told a few days ago that a theatre had been hit in which 1,000 people were seeking shelter. And then you find out just a little bit, a day or so later, that actually no one had died in this theatre being hit. Now, the truth is, I don't know what the truth is, and it's impossible to find out the truth. What we do know is that this is a major war. It's an invasion by the Russian army, a major force, and that lots of people are being killed. Lots of civilians are being killed. We don't know how many, but lots are. Infrastructure is being bombed. People's homes are being bombed. It's an invasion by a foreign, larger force operating, as I'll go on to in a moment, for its own imperial imperialist interest. We don't know how many soldiers are being killed on either side. Some of the figures to me look quite unsupported. And one of the first things to say is that we're in the middle of an information war. And in this information war, there's a big effort to prevent us asking, what are the reasons for this war? Why is this war happening? And again, I don't know about Ireland, but I know in Britain, one of the very first things that happened was to say that you cannot look at anything other than the immediacy of the Russian invasion. All that you must do is to condemn the Russian invasion and call for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. Now, I'm going to presume here, and I hope I'm not presuming against somebody else's position, but I would take it that we are, so let me put it another way. I am certainly for the withdrawal of the Russian forces from Ukraine. I don't believe that that there's any justification for. Sorry, have I got an echo? Or I don't believe that there's any justification for the Russian intervention. I don't believe that there's any kind of continuity between the current Russian regime and anything in the past which had an element or more of workers' control of Russia or the Soviet Union. But I also don't believe that there has suddenly been some mental breakdown by Vladimir Putin, or that he has embodied evil in a way that nobody else has ever, or unless we include the Hitler as we're always supposed to do. I believe that this is a product of an international inter-imperialist competition, of which Russia is not the dominant force, but is a force. And I want to go on to cover that in a few moments. But the first thing I want to emphasize is that it's absolutely right that we talk about how the left responds, but how the left responds should be conditioned, in my view, by how the working class is responding in each of our respective countries. And as far as I can see, that the main feeling among working class people in European countries, let's limit it to that, is against the invasion, certainly, with huge sympathy for the Ukrainian refugees. I mean, one of the things that's important about this, I think, is that we're often told that governmental hostility to refugees is driven by popular hostility to newcomers, driven by popular xenophobia. Well, this is the exact opposite. You find in country after country, people are in support of the Ukrainian refugees. And at the same time, you find great reluctance to endorse all sorts of wild calls to exacerbate the situation, to escalate the intervention through more punitive sanctions and through so-called no-fly zones, which means, let's be honest, means Western planes shooting down Russian planes over Ukraine. So how did we get here? Well, it didn't all start yesterday. Let's just go back the last 30 years. Prior to that, after the Second World War, we'd had the Cold War, the world divided into two dominant poles, slightly more complicated than that, but that's the gist. Of course, the West, the Washington Center bloc emerged victorious out of the Cold War. The bloc centered on Moscow defeated. The breakup of the Warsaw Pact, the breakup of the Soviet system, the breakup of territories that were considered part of Soviet Russia, a huge collapse in the course of the 1990s of the Russian economy and of Russian society. I mean, we're talking about life expectancy being thrown back by 10 or more years for men and for women in the course of the so-called restructuring of the economy, from which comes these fabled oligarchs. And oligarchs are not simply the group of very rich men and their all men actually in Russia. In Ukraine, there's been some women who are billionaires. Around Putin. It's not just that, it's the entire robbery, expropriation of what had been accumulated in Russia over the previous decades in the course of the 1990s into the 2000s, not under Vladimir Putin, but under Boris Yeltsin. Putin comes to power against Yeltsin, not with a fundamental shift of the social system towards working people to recover some of the ill-gotten gains, but essentially with a group of very powerful men around him who were certainly committed to the class relations, the capitalist class relations in Russia, but also claimed to themselves, actually, as well as to the population, that they were more patriotic, that they wanted to overturn the humiliation of Russia in the course of the 90s into the mid-2000s. And Russia was humiliated. When I say Russia, I'm not a nationalist. I don't believe that everybody in a country thinks the same or there's a national mentality or whatever. But the Russian state and by extension, the idea of people from Russia being equal with people in the West, there was humiliation throughout those 15 years. So as the West, NATO, having won, did not stop expanding, but continued to expand further east against, in defiance of promises, pledges that it had given, it again and again and again humiliated the Russian state. Now, to say that there was humiliation, but to say that NATO was expanding further and further and further, and without taking any account of Russian sensibility, is not to justify the Russian invasion, but it is to explain it. And if we don't seek to explain it, we can't look to how we end this war, can contribute to ending to this war and preventing future ones. Now, this has been demonized in certainly the Anglophone media, as far as I can see. Or, I think actually particularly the British media, because Britain has a strong anti-war movement in the course of the last 3 weeks. The idea that you can say that NATO eastward expansion and continuing to humiliate and disregard the state in Russia has had anything to do with the creation of this crisis, that this is to justify the invasion, this is almost treasonous. Well, it's happened over the last 2-3 weeks. One major US political figure after another has either come out now or have had their words disinterred, that if you do this, if you move something which is supposed to be a defensive alliance further and further east towards Moscow, this will be regarded ultimately as an aggressive act. And that's what's happening. And I'm talking about George Kennan, the major architect of US Cold War policy, Henry Kissinger, you don't get much more hawkish than that, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Even Joe Biden, in his earlier, more lucid period, said that a Russian reaction would be what would happen, and that is indeed what has happened. And it's happened growing in the last 10 to 12 years, but particularly after the overthrow, we can discuss exactly how that happened, of the president in Ukraine in 2014, who was, like all the politicians up to that point, was balancing between Russia and the EU, between Russia and NATO. He's brought down, and you have a lurch towards the West, a counter-reaction, a brief period of civil war, a secession by a group of Russian speakers, the largely Russian speaking area of the Donbass, and the whole thing kind of frozen, and no serious attempts to try to resolve the impasse, even though everybody knows what the resolution would be, which is that Ukraine should be opt to be a neutral state, and that if the West tried to drag it into its orbit, it would create a crisis in Ukraine. And if Russia tried to drag it further into its orbit, it would create a crisis which would divide Ukraine. And therefore, that the sensible thing to do would be to de-escalate. Now, of course, we're talking an inter-imperialist rivalry in which the United States is still by far, particularly when you take into account its allies, the dominant imperialist force across the globe. But Russia is also an imperialist power. It's capitalist. It has a large army. It has ambition to restore at least some of the strengths that it had. Whether, and if you listen to Putin, it's certainly not restore it on any kind of model of 1917 or the early Soviet model. It's to restore it on a Tsarist model, on a Russian nationalist model around its immediate territorial periphery. And so that's what's led up to the war in my view. And that brings us to what it is that we can do about it. The first is to recognise the nature of the war. And now there are people, I mean, Jonathan, our chair, referred to them at the beginning, who are pro-Russian in this war. I'm not going to say much about that because, first of all, it's a very tiny number of people internationally, certainly on the European left. It's not even representative of the official communist left, of the Orthodox communist parties. I mean, I'll just say that the Communist Party of Greece, which cannot be bested in its Stalinist orthodoxy, refers to what's happening as an inter-imperialist conflict. In Greece, a country which, for all sorts of reasons, had historically pro-Russian left, and not just left, but some of the right have been pro-Russian, is absolutely having nothing to do with that. So I don't really think there's much point spending a lot of time on that, although people may want to in the discussion. Much more so, I think, is the problem of the dominant left, social democracy, and broad left, which has been to rightly react against the Russian invasion, but has been to systematically fall in behind what is now a ruling class, capitalist, a bourgeois push to prevent, not only to prevent any criticism of the other side, of our side, if you know what I mean, our side in that we are part of one or other, or sometimes both of the major Western imperialist blocs, NATO and the EU in Europe, not just to prevent criticism, but actually to use this war to try to reinforce those. So we have, and then we have what I think is a terrible duplicity, to be honest, because you have governments, German, British, Greek government, who know full well that playing with talk of pouring in more arms, and arms are going in, but even more arms, and more trainers to use the arms, and even no-fly zones, that all of this risks extremely dangerous escalation. They say that on the one hand. On the other, they're trying to use this crisis to strengthen their own militaries, to strengthen the NATO alliance. So, I mean, the biggest one is that Germany, the German state, has overturned what has been for decades a kind of settled foreign policy. They have announced the formation of a fund, a remilitarization fund of 100 billion euros, and an increase to over 2% annually of the defence budget. The Greek government was already doing this, but it has used this crisis to authenticate buying new state-of-the-art fighter warships, frigates, which are directed against Turkey, which happens to be a fellow NATO member. Tomorrow, I'm pretty sure that the British Chancellor of the Exchequer in the budget will announce a big increase in military expenditure, at the same time as emphasising that there has to be limits upon social expenditure. And that, I think, is something which is going to outlast this war, however it happens. I understand, and I'd be very interested to hear from comrades what they think, but I understand, excuse me, that from Ireland, there's been a renewed and quite dangerous level of speculation about Ireland abandoning its neutrality. Now, however that neutrality has been in reality, it seems to me a very dangerous prospect. So that, I think, and that's happening. I think it's justified on parts of the left with a very, very mistaken view, and that is that we are for the right of nations to self-determination, which is not at all mistaken. It's very, very much true. But it's not possible to detach the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, from the inter-imperialist rivalry in which it takes place. Now, that doesn't mean that I think socialists should be indifferent about Russia invading Ukraine. We should be for the defeat of Russia in Ukraine and the Russian forces pulling out. But our central agency for doing that, I think, is twofold. It's the anti-war movement in Russia, about which we now hear very, very little. You know, at the beginning of this, there were, a little over 3 weeks ago, there were in the media quite a lot of reports and plaudits for Russian anti-war protesters who really face very, very serious repression. I mean, the number arrested now probably is 20,000 in Russia, which is a huge number of people just arrested for taking part in demonstrations. As the war's gone on, we've heard less and less about that, and it's become more militaristic about shooting down Russian planes or blowing up Russian tanks. And we've had far less about the movement in Russia and also civil movement in Ukraine, and of course, not much about the movements against war and for peace in our own countries. And I think one of the big problems on the left is that there's been a beyond the problem of those who have a political position, which is essentially that the expansion of NATO is the expansion of civilization. There are those people. But beyond that is a crisis of confidence and of looking, and I'm just going to end on this point in the next 2 minutes, and of starting off with the good sense of working class people. Now, I'm not going to speak for you in Ireland, but I know in Britain and I know in Greece, so people are looking at this. They want to end it. They don't want that. They don't want to act in a way which makes it worse. And they're also looking at the outflow already, even if the war stopped tomorrow, already the outflow. The IMF issued a report, I think it was yesterday or the day before, which said that this is like an earthquake to the world economy. And now when we hear those kind of terms, we know it's not an earthquake to Russian oligarchs or to Jeff Bezos. It's amazing, isn't it? These things happen, and suddenly it's the Russian billionaires who are really a problem. The Irish rich and the American rich are not really, they're our billionaires, they're our oligarchs. We know it's not going to be a problem for them. We know it is going to be a huge problem for the poor and the working class around the world. And already we're being told that this is a consequence we'll have to face. The leader of the British Labour Party, Keir Starmer, said this is going to produce economic pain for people in Britain. But like before, ordinary people in Britain are prepared to stand up and take it. Well, that's all right for him. He's on over £100,000 a year and has got a very nice house, thank you very much. It's not all right for people who are already struggling to pay the gas bill, to pay the lecky, to buy the food. And it's worse when you go to the global south. In Egypt, which imports 80% of its wheat which is the key staple in poor Egyptian diets. 80% comes from Ukraine and Russia. The price of the daily bread that people get, which is 5 kind of flat pita bread kind of things, has gone up from 5 Egyptian pounds to 7.5, so a 50% increase, which means that lots of people will not be able to afford bread. In Cyprus, they're not even sure whether they'll have the wheat to produce bread. And Cyprus is an advanced country, it's in the European Union. And so we're talking all of these impacts, as well as the immediate suffering in Ukraine and Russia, which I think, on this point, is going to lead to an intensification of struggle, both against this war, an intensification between the competing imperialist powers for resources, which is not just wheat and oil and gas, but rare earths and various other things which we now discover come from Ukraine and Russia and are very important for the functioning of the world economy. But crucially for us, I hope that it leads to an intensification of class combativity and class struggle. And then I think that there's a challenge for the left. Can we try to bring around us wider forces and have an impact on those struggles? If not, then others will. I'll say this, that on Sunday there was a big demonstration in Madrid, 150,000 people in the Spanish state, farmers, a party representing hunters and agrarian interests and so on. So you could imagine probably quite mixed politically, but 150,000 people over the price of fuel and the rising cost of living. And can the left, where we are, try to connect with what is obviously a huge feeling around both the war and the impact of this war, and try and give it a broad socialist direction and answer the difficult questions that come up?